No one could control the magnate's twins, until the new nanny did the unthinkable. Richard Harrison leaned his hands on the mahogany desk as he listened to yet another excuse over the phone. The 19th nanny in 7 months had just quit after only 10 days. His 5-year-old twin sons had turned her job into a daily nightmare. On the other end of the line, the woman was still trying to explain, but Richard had already hung up. There was no point in listening. It was always the same story. The boys were impossible, destroyed everything, obeyed no one. He ran his hand through his dark hair, feeling the weight of another failure. As a businessman, he solved million-dollar problems every day. As a father, he couldn't control 2 small boys. "What did the twins do this time?" asked Margaret, the housekeeper who had taken care of the house for 15 years, entering the office with a coffee tray. They put glue on her chair. When she sat down, she got stuck. She had to tear her skirt to get free. Margaret shook her head. But Richard noticed a slight smile on her lips. The housekeeper had a special affection for the boys, despite all their mischief. She had known those children since they were born, and knew that behind the chaos there was much more than just tantrums. "You need someone different this time," suggested Margaret, organizing the papers on the desk. All the nannies who came were either too young or too strict. "Those children don't need military discipline, they need attention." Richard felt a pang of guilt, but quickly pushed the feeling away. He gave his children everything. The mansion where they lived in Brentwood, the best clothes, the best toys. What more could he offer? His work leading one of the largest construction companies in the country didn't allow him to stay home playing with dolls. "So, do you know anyone who can handle them?" he teased, pouring himself the coffee Margaret had brought. "Actually, I do. My cousin Elizabeth just returned to Los Angeles. She lived in the countryside for years, taking care of a family there. She has experience and a lot of patience. If she's so good, why did she leave her previous job?" Margaret hesitated before answering, choosing her words carefully. "The family moved abroad. She didn't want to go along. She has personal reasons to stay in the United States." Richard watched the housekeeper for a moment. There was something she wasn't telling, but he was too tired to investigate. He needed someone urgently. Tomorrow he had an important meeting with Japanese investors and couldn't leave the twins alone with Margaret, who already had her own responsibilities in the house. "All right, call her. If she's available, she can come tomorrow for an interview." "She'll need to live here, Mr. Harrison. The apartment where she was staying belonged to the previous family." "No problem. The nanny's room is empty anyway." Margaret left the office and Richard turned his attention to the papers in front of him. Contracts, projects, numbers. There he had total control. Every decision led to a predictable outcome. Not like with the boys, who seemed like little hurricanes determined to destroy everything they touched. From upstairs, he heard the sound of something falling and breaking, another expensive object turning into pieces. Richard squeezed his eyes shut, trying to control the frustration. Since Jennifer had left 3 years ago, the house had never been the same. The boys were only 2 years old when she left, too young to understand, but old enough to feel the absence. He never spoke about Jennifer, with anyone. It was a closed subject, a painfully turned page. He focused on work, on business, on building an empire that would secure his children's future. But sometimes, in moments like this, the guilt returned. Could the boys be like this because of him? Because of his constant absences? Richard pushed those thoughts away. There was no use tormenting himself. He was doing the best he could under the circumstances. Tomorrow this Elizabeth would come, and maybe, just maybe, she would succeed where the other 18 had failed. That night, after Margaret finally got the twins to sleep, Richard went up to their room. The door was slightly ajar, and he stood on the threshold, watching the 2 sleeping boys. Michael and Matthew. Identical even in the way they slept, each curled up in their beds, hugging their pillows. In the dark, they looked like angels. It was hard to believe that those little children with blonde hair and peaceful faces were the same boys who had made 19 adults quit. Richard entered the room quietly and adjusted Michael's blanket, which he had kicked off in his sleep. The boys stirred, murmuring something incomprehensible, but didn't wake up. Richard stood there for a few minutes just watching. He felt immense love for those two, but also a distance he didn't know how to bridge. He hadn't been raised in a loving home. His own father, also a businessman, had been a cold and distant man. Richard had sworn he would be different, but in the end, he was repeating the same pattern. He left the room with a heavy heart and went down to his office. He had reports to review, emails to answer. The work never ended. But that night, for the first time in a long time, Richard found himself looking at the framed photo on the shelf, a family photo taken when the twins were 1 year old. Jennifer was there, smiling, holding Matthew in her lap while he held Michael. They looked happy. Had they been? Or was it just an illusion captured by the camera? Richard put the photo away in the drawer. There was no use living in the past. The future was what mattered now. The next morning, as Richard was getting ready to leave, the doorbell rang. He was in the bedroom changing his shirt when he heard Margaret answer the door. Female voices reached him, muffled by the distance. It must be that Elizabeth. He finished getting ready and went down the stairs. In the living room, he found Margaret talking to a woman who must have been in her early 40s. She wore simple but clean clothes, carried a worn-out suitcase in one hand, and had short black hair framing a face with soft features. What caught Richard's attention the most were her eyes. Brown, deep, with an expression that mixed determination and an old sadness. "Mr. Richard, this is my cousin Elizabeth," Margaret introduced. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison," greeted Elizabeth, extending her hand. Her voice was calm, firm. "Margaret told me about the position." Richard shook her hand, noticing the firm grip. She wasn't a fragile woman. That was clear immediately. "I need to be honest with you, Elizabeth. My children are challenging. We've had 19 nannies in the last few months. The most resilient lasted 3 weeks. Margaret explained the situation to me," Elizabeth replied without hesitation. "Children aren't challenging without a reason. There's always something behind the behavior." "Do you have children?" asked Richard, more out of curiosity than a need to know. Elizabeth's face closed off for a moment, a shadow passing through her eyes. But she recovered quickly. "I did. A long time ago." The ambiguous answer left Richard intrigued, but he didn't press. Everyone had their secrets and pains. He certainly had his. "All right, I'll be direct. I need someone who can handle the boys, keep them safe, and if possible prevent them from completely destroying the house. In return, I offer a good salary, room and board, weekly days off, but I need commitment. I can't keep changing nannies every week." "I don't give up easily, Mr. Harrison," Elizabeth assured. "I just need a chance." Richard looked at Margaret, who nodded discreetly. He sighed. "All right, you can start today. Margaret will show you the room and explain the routine. I need to leave now. I have an important meeting. The boys are still sleeping, but they'll wake up soon. Good luck." "Thank you, Mr. Harrison. You won't regret it." Richard grabbed his jacket and briefcase, casting one last look at Elizabeth before leaving. There was something about that woman that intrigued him. A quiet strength, as if she had weathered storms and survived. Perhaps that was exactly what the boys needed. Someone who wouldn't crumble at the first sign of difficulty. On his way to the office, Richard tried to focus on the meeting he had in a few hours. Japanese investors interested in a mega project on the California coast. It was a golden opportunity, but it required his full concentration. He couldn't keep thinking about the boys and the new nanny. But it was hard. Part of him, the part that still struggled to be a better father, wondered if Elizabeth would really manage, or if in a few days he'd receive another call of resignation. Meanwhile, at the mansion, Elizabeth climbed the stairs carrying her suitcase, following Margaret to the room that would be hers. It was a simple but comfortable space with a bed, a wardrobe, a small table, and a window overlooking the backyard garden. Much better than some places she had lived. "The boys will wake up soon," Margaret warned, standing at the door. "When they wake up, it's like a bomb goes off in the house. Make their breakfast, but don't force anything. If they don't want to eat, don't insist. We learned the hard way that forcing only makes it worse." "I understand," said Elizabeth, putting her few clothes in the wardrobe. "And, Elizabeth," Margaret hesitated, "don't take the things they do personally. They're not bad boys. They're just lost." Elizabeth turned to her cousin, and for the first time a small smile touched her lips. "I know how to recognize a lost child, Margaret. I've taken care of a few in my life." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. Half an hour later, Elizabeth was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard the first signs of movement upstairs. Quick footsteps, high-pitched voices, the sound of something being dragged. Margaret had gone out shopping, leaving Elizabeth alone for the first encounter with the twins. She remained calm, making pancakes and cutting fruit. She had learned over the years that children could sense adults' nervousness. The calmer you stayed, the better your chances of handling the situation. The footsteps raced down the stairs. Elizabeth heard giggles before she saw the boys. When they entered the kitchen, she had her back turned, flipping pancakes in the pan. She turned slowly and saw two identical boys with messy blonde hair and blue eyes sparkling with curiosity and mischief. "Good morning," Elizabeth greeted naturally. "You must be Michael and Matthew." The boys exchanged looks, surprised. Usually new nannies got nervous or tried to assert authority right away. This woman seemed different. "Who are you?" one of them asked. Elizabeth still couldn't tell who was who. "I'm Elizabeth. I'll be here helping to take care of you for a while." "You'll leave soon," said the other boy, with a certainty that sounded odd coming from such a young child. "They all leave." "Is that so?" Elizabeth turned her attention back to the pancakes, flipping them in the pan. "Why do they all leave?" "Because we're terrible," replied the first, but there was a tone of sadness behind the proud declaration. Elizabeth placed the pancakes on 2 plates and brought them to the table, along with honey and fruit. "I don't think you're terrible. I think you're just 5-year-old twins. Are you making pancakes, or do you want something else?" The boys approached the table cautiously. They smelled the food, looked at Elizabeth, then at each other. They sat down, but didn't eat. "Aren't you hungry?" asked Elizabeth, pouring herself some coffee. "We're testing you," announced one of them. "Oh, and what's the test?" "If you get mad when we don't eat, you're just like the others." Elizabeth took a sip of coffee, thoughtful. "I see. Well, if you don't want to eat now, that's fine, but I'll leave the plates here on the table. If you change your mind, the food is there. I'm going to tidy up my room." She stood up and started to leave the kitchen. She heard the boys' confused whispers behind her. She hadn't even reached the door when one of them called her. "Wait," Elizabeth turned around. The 2 boys were looking at her with curious expressions. "Aren't you going to stay here watching us eat?" asked the other. "Would you prefer me to stay?" The boys looked at each other again, seeming confused by the question. No one had ever asked them what they preferred. "You can stay," said one of them quietly. Elizabeth came back and sat at the table. The boys started eating, slowly at first, then with more enthusiasm. The pancakes were good, they had to admit. "Which one of you is Michael and which is Matthew?" asked Elizabeth. "I'm Michael," said the boy on the left, sticky with syrup. "And I'm Matthew," added the one on the right, his mouth full of pancake. "Nice to meet you. You look very much alike. I'll need some time to learn to tell you apart." "No one can," stated Michael. "We switch places and fool everyone." "Even Dad gets confused," laughed Matthew. Elizabeth smiled slightly. She knew that game. Twins often used their resemblance as a form of power, as control over a world that often saw them as a unit rather than individuals. "Then you'll have to help me. Is there any way for me to tell who's who?" The boys seemed to consider the question with unexpected seriousness. "I have a mole here," said Michael, pointing behind his left ear, "and my voice is a bit deeper. And I have a tiny scar on my knee," showed Matthew, lifting his leg. "I fell off the swing last year." Elizabeth observed the small differences they pointed out, marks of individuality that they kept, details they wanted someone to notice. That said a lot about what those children were missing. "I'll pay attention," promised Elizabeth, "and you let me know if I mix you up, okay?" "Okay," both agreed, finishing their pancakes. After breakfast, the boys seemed unsure what to do. They stayed in the kitchen, watching Elizabeth wash the dishes. She could feel their curious, evaluating gazes. They were waiting for her to do something the other nannies did. give orders, set rules, try to control them. But Elizabeth did none of that. She finished washing the dishes, dried her hands, and asked, "What do you usually do in the morning?" "Nothing," replied Michael. "The nannies always want us to stay quiet in our room." "And do you?" "No," smiled Matthew. "We sneak out and make a mess." "I see. And what do you like to do, when you can do whatever you want?" The boys looked at each other once more, that silent communication twins seemed to have. Then Matthew said, "We like to play outside. There's a big garden with trees." "Can we go outside?" asked Elizabeth. "You're not going to tell us to study or be quiet. You're 5 years old, plenty of time to study. And as for being quiet, well, I don't know any 5-year-old who can really stay quiet. Shall we go outside?" The boys ran ahead, bursting into laughter as they pushed the door to the garden. Elizabeth followed at a calmer pace, watching. The garden was truly enormous, well-maintained, with fruit trees, a complete playground, and lots of green space. The twins ran straight to a pile of dirt in the corner of the garden. Elizabeth approached and saw that it was an area where apparently some renovation had been started and abandoned. There was gravel, sand, some pieces of wood. "Dad was going to make a vegetable garden here," explained Michael, "but he got too busy and forgot." "Would you like to make the vegetable garden?" asked Elizabeth. "We can?" Matthew seemed disbelieving. "Why not? But it would have to be your project. I'll help, but you decide what to plant and take care of the plants. Deal?" The boys' eyes sparkled. They had never had their own project, something that was just theirs. There were always adults telling them what to do, how to do it, when to do it. That woman was offering something different. "Deal!" they shouted in unison. Elizabeth smiled. It was a start. Small, but it was a start. She knew that winning the trust of hurt children was a slow process. There were no tricks or shortcuts, only presence, patience, and genuine interest in who they were. They spent the whole morning in the garden. Elizabeth helped the boys clean the area, separate the good soil, organize the space. They got completely dirty with dirt, but they were happier than she had ever seen them. They chatted excitedly about what they could plant, whether tomatoes would grow fast, if strawberry plants would yield lots of strawberries. When Margaret returned from shopping and saw the scene from the kitchen window, she stood still for a moment, surprised. The boys were covered in mud but smiling, and Elizabeth, equally dirty, was laughing with them while one of them tried to make a ball of dirt. "You three are going to need a good bath," said Margaret, stepping out into the garden with her hands on her hips, but there was a smile on her lips. "Aunt Margaret," Matthew ran to her, "we're going to make a vegetable garden, for real." "Really? How cool. But before lunch, everyone takes a bath, agreed?" The boys agreed without complaining and ran into the house. Margaret approached Elizabeth, who was wiping her hands on a cloth. "How did you manage it?" asked the housekeeper, incredulous. "It's too early to celebrate," replied Elizabeth. "But they just needed someone who would really listen to them, who would let them be children." "Did the other employees try to control too much?" "They tried to control because they were afraid. And children sense fear. They react to it." Margaret shook her head, impressed. Perhaps, just perhaps, Elizabeth was exactly what that house needed. The afternoon passed surprisingly calmly. After lunch, the boys asked to go back to the garden, but Elizabeth suggested they make a plan first. She grabbed paper and pencils and sat with them in the living room, drawing what the vegetable garden would look like, which vegetables to plant, where each one would go. The boys participated actively, giving ideas, disagreeing with each other, reaching agreements. Elizabeth merely facilitated, asking questions, helping them think about the consequences of each choice. It was educational work, disguised as fun, and the twins didn't even realize they were learning about planning, patience, and teamwork. When Richard arrived home in the late afternoon, he expected to find the usual chaos. Instead, he heard laughter coming from the living room. He approached quietly and saw his children sitting on the floor with Elizabeth, all bent over sheets of paper full of drawings. "And here we can put the carrots," said Michael, pointing to a corner of the drawing. "But carrots need really deep soil," explained Elizabeth, "so we have to dig a lot in that spot. It will be hard work. Are you up for it?" "We're up for it," assured Matthew. "And can we put sunflowers too?" "Sunflowers?" Elizabeth smiled. I love the idea. They will make the garden beautiful." It was then that Matthew looked up and saw his father standing in the doorway. His face lit up for a second, but soon his expression changed as if he were remembering something. Michael also noticed his father's presence and had the same initial reaction of joy, followed by caution. "Hi, Dad," they greeted at the same time, but without standing up. "Hi, boys." Richard entered the room, uncomfortable with the domestic scene before him. He didn't quite know how to act. "What are you doing?" "Planning our garden," explained Michael. "Liz is going to help us plant." Liz? They had already created a nickname for her. Richard looked at Elizabeth, who stood up respectfully. "How was the first day?" he asked, trying to sound professional. "Smooth," replied Elizabeth. "The boys behaved very well." Richard raised an eyebrow, surprised. He looked at his sons, who seemed genuinely pleased. No broken objects, no tears, no tantrums. It was almost suspicious. "That's good." He didn't know what else to say. "I'm going upstairs to change clothes. We'll talk about the routine later." "Of course, Mr. Harrison." Richard went up to the bedroom, taking off his jacket as he processed what he had seen. In one day, Elizabeth had achieved something that none of the other employees had managed, making the boys smile. Really smile, not those mischievous grins that preceded some mischief. They were genuine smiles from happy children. Part of him was pleased. Another part felt jealousy? Envy? He was the father, but he had never been able to elicit those smiles from the boys. He worked hard to give them everything, but it seemed that nothing he offered was enough. And then this woman came along on the first day and achieved the impossible. Richard pushed these thoughts away. It wasn't a competition. If Elizabeth could make the boys happy, great. That was exactly what he was paying her to do. There was nothing personal about it. But as he changed clothes, he couldn't stop thinking about the scene he had witnessed. Everyone sitting on the floor laughing together, planning something simple like a garden. When was the last time he had sat on the floor to play with his children? He couldn't remember. When he went down for dinner, he found the table set and the boys already seated, still talking animatedly about the garden. Elizabeth was in the kitchen helping Margaret bring the food. Richard sat at the head of the table, watching his children. "Dad, are you going to help us with the garden?" asked Matthew, hopeful. Richard hesitated. His schedule was packed for the next few weeks. He had meetings, site inspections, dinners with clients. "I'll try," he replied vaguely. "But you know Dad works a lot." "You always work a lot," said Michael, not as a complaint but as a statement of fact. "It's because Dad's work is important," explained Richard, the same excuse he always gave. "I need to make sure you have everything you need." "We already have everything we need," murmured Matthew so softly that Richard almost didn't hear it. Dinner proceeded in tense silence. The boys ate mechanically. Their earlier enthusiasm evaporated. Richard tried to start a conversation a few times, but the responses were monosyllabic. He didn't understand what had happened. Minutes ago they were so happy, and now they seemed withdrawn. Elizabeth, who was eating discreetly at the corner of the table, watched everything in silence. She clearly saw what Richard didn't notice, the hope that lit up in the boys' eyes when they spoke with their father, and how that hope faded in the face of his evasive answers. It was a cycle that probably repeated constantly. After dinner, Elizabeth took the boys to bathe and get ready for bed. Richard returned to his office, immersing himself in the papers he had brought from work. It was his refuge, the place where he knew exactly what to do. Later, Elizabeth knocked on the office door. "May I speak with you for a moment?" "Of course, come in." She entered but remained standing, keeping a respectful distance. Richard indicated the chair in front of the desk, but she didn't sit. "The boys are asleep," she informed. "They wanted you to come say goodnight, but I said you were busy." "Oh." Richard felt another pang of guilt. "I should have gone." "Yes, you should." Elizabeth's frankness surprised him. None of the other nannies would have dared speak to him like that. "Excuse my honesty, Mr. Harrison, but those boys don't need expensive toys or a huge mansion. They need their father." Richard straightened in his chair, irritation rising. "You've been here one day and already think you can lecture me on how I should raise my children?" I'm not lecturing. I'm saying what anyone who spends half an hour with them can see. They test boundaries, make messes, get nannies fired because they're asking for attention. And not just any attention, yours. I work to give them a good future. Richard defended himself, standing up. So they won't lack anything. But they are lacking. They're lacking you. Elizabeth kept her tone calm, unflinching. I'm sorry to be so direct, but if you hired me to care for the boys, you need to listen to me. I can keep them safe, fed, even happy during the day. But when night comes and their father barely talks at dinner, all my work goes down the drain. Richard fell silent, processing the harsh words. His first reaction was to fire her on the spot. Who did she think she was? But something stopped him. Maybe it was the fact that deep down he knew she was right. Or maybe it was because no one had ever had the courage to tell him the truth before. And what do you suggest I do? He asked finally, sitting back down. I have responsibilities. I can't just drop everything. I'm not asking you to drop everything. I'm asking you to set aside some time, even if it's small, just for them. Have dinner with the boys without thinking about work. Go say goodnight before they sleep. Ask about their day and really listen to their answers. They're simple things, but they make all the difference. Richard rubbed his face with his hands, tired. When had he become that kind of father? When had being absent become acceptable? I'll try, he said after a long silence. Okay, that's all they need, for you to try. Elizabeth left the office, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts. He looked at the papers scattered on the desk, the contracts he needed to review, the projects that depended on him. But for the first time in a long time, it didn't seem so important. He got up and went up to the boys' room. The door was slightly ajar, and he entered quietly. Michael and Matthew were asleep, each hugging their own pillow. Richard approached, watching them as he had the night before. But this time, something was different. The boys seemed calmer, more at peace. Was it just one day with Elizabeth that had made this difference? Or was it because, for the first time in a long time, they had experienced what it was like to have someone truly present, truly interested in what they said and did? Richard kissed each one's forehead, something he hadn't done in months. Michael stirred, murmuring something, and Richard stood still, waiting. But the boy fell back into a deep sleep. I promise I'll try to be better, Richard whispered, knowing they couldn't hear him but needing to say it anyway. You deserve a better father. He left the room with a heart both lighter and heavier. Lighter because he had made a decision, heavier because he knew keeping it would be hard. Change isn't easy, especially when you've spent years building walls around your own heart. That night, for the first time in a long time, Richard didn't work late. He went to his room early, lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling, thinking. Thinking about Jennifer, about how everything had fallen apart, about how he had used work as an escape. Thinking about his children, about how much time he had lost, about how much he could still recover. And thinking about Elizabeth, the strange woman who had arrived that morning and in just a few hours had turned his life upside down. There was something about her, a silent strength, a wisdom that came from having gone through something difficult. He wondered what her story was, what was behind those sad eyes. But those were questions for another day. For now, the important thing was to focus on what really mattered, reconnecting with his children before it was too late. The following days brought a new routine to the Harrison house. Elizabeth woke up early, made breakfast for the boys, and together they spent the mornings in the garden working in the vegetable patch. They had gone to a nursery on the second day, and the twins carefully chose each plant: tomatoes, lettuce, carrots, and yes, sunflowers. Planting became an adventure. Elizabeth taught them about the soil, about how each plant needed different care, about patience. The boys learned without realizing they were learning. It was education disguised as fun, exactly as it should be for 5-year-olds. Margaret watched from afar, amazed. The house had changed in just days. There were no more shouts, broken objects, or tearful maids. Instead, there was laughter, conversation, life. The boys were still mischievous, of course, but in a healthy, age-appropriate way. No longer that desperate destructiveness. You have a gift, Margaret said to Elizabeth one afternoon as they prepared a snack. With children, it's not a gift, it's just paying attention. Elizabeth peeled oranges, arranging the slices on a plate. Children aren't complicated, they're honest. If you're honest with them, they trust you. But you have experience. You said you've taken care of other families. Yes. Elizabeth's face closed up a little, as it always did when the subject approached her past. I've taken care of many children over the years. Margaret noticed the change, but didn't press. Her cousin had always been reserved about certain things. There were pains she carried, that was obvious. But Margaret respected Elizabeth's silence just as she hoped others would respect her own. Richard had also noticed the change in the house. It was impossible not to. He had been trying, as promised, to be more present. He had dinner with the boys every night, asked about the vegetable patch, about what they had done during the day. At first, the twins were cautious, as if they expected it to be temporary. But gradually they opened up. "Daddy, the lettuce already has 5 little leaves," Matthew said excitedly during one dinner. "And tomorrow Liz is going to teach us how to make a scarecrow," Michael added, "to protect the plants from the birds." "A scarecrow," Richard smiled. "That should be interesting." "Can you help?" Matthew asked, hopeful but afraid of rejection. Richard hesitated. He had an important meeting the next morning, but he looked at his son's hopeful faces and made a decision. "I can get to the office a little later. I'll help you start the scarecrow before I leave." The boys burst with joy, getting up to hug their father. Richard wrapped his arms around them, feeling something melt inside him. When was the last time his children had hugged him like that, spontaneously, out of pure joy? Elizabeth, who had just brought dessert, witnessed the scene and smiled discreetly. They were small steps, but important ones. The family was rebuilding piece by piece. That night, after the boys had fallen asleep, Richard sought out Elizabeth. She was in her room, reading an old book. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, standing at the door. "I just wanted to thank you for what you're doing for the boys, and for making me see what I was doing wrong." "You weren't doing anything wrong, Mr. Harrison. You were just lost. We all get lost sometimes." Speaking from experience, Elizabeth closed the book but didn't answer immediately. Richard noticed he'd touched on a sensitive subject. "Sorry, didn't mean to be invasive." "It's all right." Elizabeth stood up. "Yes, I know what it's like to be lost. I know what it's like to lose sight of what really matters until it's too late." There was so much pain in those words that Richard found himself wanting to know more, but he respected her space. "Thank you again. Good night, Elizabeth." "Good night, Mr. Harrison." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like the video and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. The next morning, truly for the first time since he could remember, Richard woke up before the alarm. He changed clothes quickly, putting on jeans and a simple shirt instead of his usual suit. When he went downstairs, he found Elizabeth and the boys already in the garden, gathering materials for the scarecrow. "Daddy!" Matthew ran when he saw him. "You came. I promised, didn't I? So how do we make this scarecrow?" Elizabeth had already prepared everything: wooden sticks for the frame, old clothes to dress the scarecrow, straw for stuffing, paints and brushes for the face. The boys were buzzing with excitement. They spent the whole morning working together. Richard discovered he had manual skills he never knew he possessed: tying the sticks, helping the boys stuff the clothes, laughing when Matthew accidentally spilled straw on Michael's head. Elizabeth supervised, making suggestions but letting the 3 of them do the work. "He needs a name," Michael decided, when the scarecrow was finally ready and standing in the middle of the vegetable patch. "How about Beckham?" Richard suggested. "Beckham?" Matthew laughed. "Why Beckham? He was a very famous player. When I was little like you, I loved watching him play." "Then let's call him Beckham," Michael agreed. "He'll protect our vegetable patch." They stood there, the 3 of them looking at the clumsy scarecrow they had created together. It wasn't perfect, it was even a bit crooked, but it was theirs. A family creation. "I need to go now," Richard said, checking his watch. "I'm already late for the meeting." "It's okay, Dad," said Matthew. "Thank you for helping." "Thank you for letting me help." Richard kissed each of them on the head. "I'll be home earlier today, Deal." "Deal!" Richard rushed out, grabbing the jacket he'd left in the entryway. He was indeed late, but he didn't regret it. Those hours with his children were worth any missed meeting. In the car on the way to the office, he caught himself smiling. It had been so simple, so natural. Building a ridiculous scarecrow on a Wednesday morning. Why had it taken him so long to do something like that? The weeks passed and the Harrison household continued its transformation. The vegetable patch grew, the plants sprouted, and along with them something more delicate blossomed. The reconnection between father and sons. Richard had reorganized his schedule, delegating more tasks, refusing some commitments. He still worked a lot, but now he reserved sacred time for the boys. Elizabeth watched this evolution with quiet satisfaction. Her job there wasn't just to care for the twins, but to help that family heal. And it was working slowly, but it was working. But not everything was smooth sailing. There were difficult moments, days when the boys regressed, returning to destructive behaviors. Days when Richard, under pressure at work, became impatient and distant. Days when Elizabeth would lock herself in her room, fighting against painful memories that insisted on returning. On one of those difficult nights, Margaret found Elizabeth sitting in the garden under the moonlight, with silent tears streaming down her face. "Cousin, what happened?" asked Margaret, sitting down beside her. "Nothing. It's just, today would have been their birthday." Margaret didn't need to ask whose. She knew. All those years she had respected Elizabeth's silence on that matter, but perhaps it was time to finally talk about it. How old would they have been? 15. Elizabeth's voice trembled. They would have been teenagers. I keep imagining what they would have been like. If they would still look alike, if they would have different tastes, if they would fight like normal siblings do. How long has it been? 10 years, but it feels like yesterday. And it also feels like an eternity ago. Margaret wrapped her cousin in a hug. Elizabeth allowed herself to cry, something she rarely did. The pain of loss never completely disappeared. It just lay dormant, waiting for moments of weakness to return with full force. "Taking care of Michael and Matthew must be hard for you," said Margaret gently. "Because of their age, being twins." "Yes, but it's also healing in a way. Being able to give them what I couldn't give to mine. Protect them, watch them grow, even though they're not mine." "What happened, Liz? You never really told me. You only said they were gone." Elizabeth remained silent for a long moment, wrestling internally. Carrying that burden alone for so many years had been exhausting. Perhaps it was time to share the load. "It was my fault," she began, her voice hoarse. "I was working. I was a cleaner in a commercial building, working the night shift. I couldn't take the boys with me, so I left them with a neighbor. She charged cheap, but I should have realized it was too cheap. She was taking care of 6 children at the same time in that small apartment. There was no way she could pay attention to everyone." "Oh, Liz, that night." Elizabeth had to stop, taking a deep breath to continue. "There was a short circuit. Old wiring, old apartment. A fire started. The neighbor managed to get 4 children out, but when she tried to go back for my children and another child, the ceiling collapsed, blocked the passage. The firefighters arrived quickly, but..." She couldn't finish. She didn't need to. Margaret held her hand tightly, sharing the unspeakable pain. "It wasn't your fault," said Margaret firmly. "You were working to support your children. You were a mother doing the best you could." Everyone said that. The psychologist, the social workers, even the priest, but none of it took away the guilt. If I had found another job, if I had found another place to leave them, if I had been there. But you weren't, and there's nothing that can change that now. What you can do is honor their memory by living, helping other children, being the amazing person you are." Elizabeth wiped her tears, trying to compose herself. "That's why I do this work, taking care of children. At first I thought I couldn't do it, that it would be too painful, but I realized it's the only thing that makes me feel close to them. Every child I help, every smile I bring, is a way to honor my boys. And you've helped many children, including Michael and Matthew. They've been transformed since you arrived. They're special." Elizabeth smiled through her tears. "So much like mine, but so different too. Sometimes I look at them and it hurts, but it's a good hurt, as if my children were giving me another chance to take care of twins, to make a difference in their lives." The two of them sat there for a while longer, under the starry sky, sharing silences and memories. It was the first time in years that Elizabeth had opened up completely about her loss, and although it still hurt, there was also a strange relief. Perhaps Margaret was right. Perhaps it was time to stop just surviving and start truly living again. What Elizabeth didn't know was that someone else had overheard that conversation. Richard had gone down to get water in the kitchen when he heard voices in the garden. He didn't mean to eavesdrop, but upon recognizing Elizabeth's voice full of pain, he stood still, listening unintentionally. Now, as he quietly returned to his room, he processed what he had discovered. Elizabeth had lost her own twin children. It all made sense now. The way she cared for Michael and Matthew, the dedication, the endless patience. She wasn't just doing a job. She was healing old wounds through the boys. Richard sat on the edge of the bed, troubled. Would it be fair to let her continue there? Wouldn't it be cruel, allowing her to become attached to children who weren't hers, reliving a pain that should be in the past? But then he thought about how the boys had changed, how happy they were, how the house had transformed. Elizabeth also seemed lighter lately, despite the pain she obviously carried. Perhaps this was good for everyone. Perhaps it was a mutual healing. Still, Richard decided to stay alert. He couldn't allow that situation to become harmful, neither for Elizabeth nor for his children. It was a fine line, and he would have to make sure no one got hurt. The following days were normal on the surface, but something had changed. Richard watched Elizabeth with different eyes now, noticing small details that had gone unnoticed before. The way her eyes filled with tears when the boys hugged her, how her voice grew hoarse when she sang lullabies. The moments when she stopped in the middle of an activity, lost in distant thoughts. Elizabeth in turn felt Richard's different gaze, but didn't know how to interpret it. He was more observant, more present, not only with the boys, but also attentive to her. It was disconcerting. One morning, Richard decided to confront the situation directly. He called Elizabeth for a talk in his office, while the boys watched cartoons in the living room. "Please have a seat," he requested, indicating the chair. Elizabeth sat down, apprehensive. His tone was serious, formal. Had she done something wrong? "I overheard you and Margaret talking in the garden a few nights ago," Richard began, deciding to be direct. "It wasn't intentional, but I heard about your children." Elizabeth's face lost its color. She had kept that secret for so long, and now he knew. Her first reaction was shame, exposure. Then came fear. Was he going to fire her, say she wasn't suitable to care for the boys? "I should have told you from the start," she said softly. "But I didn't know how. And I was afraid you wouldn't hire me if you knew." "Why wouldn't I hire you?" "Because you'd think I'm using your children to replace mine. That I can't separate them." "And perhaps you're right." Richard leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. "I'm telling you this not to fire you, Elizabeth. I'm saying it because we need to have honesty between us. You're taking care of my children. I need to know where you are emotionally if you're here for the right reasons." "I love what I do," Elizabeth defended herself passionately. "And yes, taking care of twins is hard for me, but it's not harmful. It's healing. Every day with Michael and Matthew helps me heal a little more, and I hope I'm helping them too." "You are. That's undeniable. They're transformed. But my concern is, what happens when you're healed? When you no longer need to be here? Do you leave and abandon them?" The question hit Elizabeth hard. She hadn't thought about that. She was so focused on the present that she hadn't considered the future. What would happen when the time came to leave? Would she be able to? And the boys who had already grown so attached to her. "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "I didn't think that far ahead." "Then maybe it's time to think." Richard wasn't cruel, but he was pragmatic. "I'm not saying you have to leave. I'm saying we need to be clear about this situation for everyone's good. Do you want me to leave? No, but I want you to ask yourself, can you continue here in a healthy way, without projecting your children onto mine? Because if you can't, it's better to know now than months from now when the boys are even more attached." Elizabeth fell silent, processing. It was a fair question, no matter how painful it was to admit. She had built an entire life taking care of other children, always maintaining a safe emotional distance. But with Michael and Matthew, that distance had disappeared. She cared too much, loved too much. It was dangerous. "I'll think about it," she promised, standing up. "And thank you for your honesty." "Elizabeth," Richard called her when she was already at the door. "I don't want you to leave. I just want you to stay for the right reasons. Not out of guilt or because of the past, but because you really want to be here, with these children, in this family." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out, now continuing. Richard's words echoed in Elizabeth's mind for the following days. She continued taking care of the boys, but now with a different awareness, observing her own emotions, trying to understand her motivations. Was she there for the boys or for herself? Where did healing end and unhealthy attachment begin? The twins noticed that something was different. Elizabeth was still affectionate, still played with them, but there was a distance that wasn't there before, as if part of her was always far away, thoughtful. "Liz is sad," Michael said to his brother one afternoon while they were tending the garden. "Did we do something wrong?" worried Matthew. "I don't know. Let's ask." When Elizabeth came to check on the plants, the boys surrounded her, their faces worried. "Liz, are you mad at us?" asked Michael directly. "What? No, of course not. Why would you think that?" "You're different," explained Matthew. "Quieter. It seems like you're always thinking about other things." Elizabeth knelt down, coming to the boys' level. They deserved honesty, within what they could understand. "I'm not mad, I'm just thinking about some important things. But nothing to do with you, I promise." "Are you leaving?" Michael's voice trembled as he asked the question. "Like the others?" "Because if you are, we'd rather you tell us now," added Matthew, trying to look strong but with teary eyes. "They always say they'll stay, and then they leave." Elizabeth felt her heart tighten. Those boys had already lost so much, had been abandoned so many times. The mother who left, the nannies who gave up, the emotionally distant father. And now she, with her own problems, was making them worry about abandonment again. "I'm not leaving," she said, pulling both of them into a hug. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm sorry I made you worry. I just have some thoughts on my mind, but nothing about leaving, okay?" "Promise?" asked Michael. "I promise." The boys hugged her tighter, and Elizabeth realized something important. It didn't matter what her initial motivations were. It didn't matter if it started as a way to heal. The fact was that now she genuinely loved those children for who they were, not for what they represented, and they needed her as much as she needed them. That night, Elizabeth sought out Richard again in his office. "I thought about what you said," she began, "and you were right. I needed to question my motives. But now I know for sure. I'm here because I love these boys, not because they remind me of my own children, but because they're unique, special, and deserve someone who truly cares. If you still want me to stay, I want to stay. Not just as an employee, but as part of this family." Richard studied her for a long moment, searching her face for any sign of doubt. He found none. What he saw was sincerity, determination, and genuine love. "Then stay," he said simply, "and not as an employee. As you said, as part of the family. The boys need you, Elizabeth, and I think I need you too. Someone to remind me of what really matters when I forget." Something shifted in the air at that moment. An unspoken understanding, a tacit agreement that this peculiar family was forming in a way no one had planned, but that made perfect sense. The months passed and the household routine solidified. Elizabeth was no longer seen as an employee, but as a beloved aunt, someone essential in the twins' lives. Margaret was happy to see her cousin finally find a place where she belonged, where she was loved and needed. Richard continued his journey of being a better father, each day learning a little more about his children, about himself. There were still difficult days, days when work consumed everything. But he always came back, he always tried. And the boys noticed, appreciating every small effort. The vegetable garden grew, becoming productive. The twins harvested vegetables they had planted themselves, proud of every ripe tomato, every perfect lettuce. The Beckham scarecrow remained there, somewhat crooked but faithful to its post. It became a symbol of that family, imperfect but united. But peace never lasts forever, and changes were on the horizon. One day, Richard came home early, with a serious expression that Elizabeth had learned to recognize. It meant trouble at work. He asked to speak with her privately. "I've received an offer from Washington, D.C., he explained, sitting at the kitchen table while Elizabeth made coffee. "A huge project, the biggest of my career, but I'd have to spend at least 3 months there, supervising personally." "I understand," said Elizabeth, feeling her heart tighten. 3 months was a long time. "And the boys?" "That's the issue. I can't take them. It would be too disruptive to their routine, to their school, and I can't turn down this project. It's too important." So you want me to take care of them while you're away?" "It's not just that." Richard ran his hand through his hair, a gesture Elizabeth had learned meant he was trying to say something difficult. "I want you to have legal authorization to make decisions about them, to leave the country if necessary, to sign school documents, things like that. I don't want you all stuck here if something important comes up." "You trust me that much?" "I trust you more than anyone else in the world when it comes to my children." The sincerity in his voice was touching. "You love them, Elizabeth. That's more important than any blood tie." Elizabeth felt tears burning her eyes. It was an enormous responsibility, but also a gift, to be entrusted with what Richard held most precious. "I'll take care of them as if they were my own," she promised. "I know. That's why I'm asking." The news of the trip was devastating for the twins. When Richard told them that same night, Michael started crying immediately. "You just came back," he accused between sobs. "You were being a real dad, and now you're leaving again." "I know, son, but I have no choice. It's only for 3 months. 3 months is so many days." Matthew was equally upset, but expressed his pain with anger. "You always say you'll come back, and you never do when you promise." "This time is different," Richard tried, but the children didn't want to hear it. Elizabeth watched the scene with a broken heart. She understood the boy's frustration, but she also understood Richard's position. It was an impossible situation, with no right answer. "Boys," she gently intervened, "shall we go to the garden? I need help with something in the vegetable patch." The twins, still teary-eyed, followed her. Richard stayed in the living room, feeling like the worst father in the world. He knew he was disappointing his children again, but what could he do? That project wasn't just important for his career, it was important for the company's future, for everyone's financial security. In the garden, Elizabeth sat with the boys beside the sunflower bed, which now stood tall and vibrant. "Do you remember when we planted these seeds?" she asked. "I remember," sniffled Michael. "They were tiny. And I said they would need time and patience to grow, remember? That we couldn't rush their growth?" The boys nodded. "Love is similar." Elizabeth chose her words carefully. "Your father is learning to be a better dad. He's growing like these plants. But sometimes, even when we're growing, we have to do difficult things. Your father doesn't want to leave, but he has to. Just like sometimes we need to prune a plant so it can grow stronger." "But 3 months." Matthew's voice still trembled. "That is a lot of days, it's true. But I'll be here with you, and we'll do something special. Each day we'll write a message or make a drawing for your father. When he returns, he'll have 90 days of your love to read. Doesn't that sound better?" The boys thought about it. It didn't completely solve the pain, but it gave them a purpose, a way to keep the connection despite the distance. "Can we do video calls?" asked Michael hopefully. "Every day if you want," Elizabeth assured. "We'll make Daddy miss us so much he'll fly back as soon as he can." A small smile touched Matthew's lips. It wasn't the ideal solution, but it was something. It was better than just accepting the absence without a fight. The following week was spent on preparations. Richard organized all the necessary documentation, giving Elizabeth powers of attorney and official authorizations. It was a process that brought them even closer, united by the shared responsibility for the boys. "If anything happens, anything at all, you call me immediately," Richard instructed the night before his departure. No matter the time, no matter the reason. I'll drop everything and come back. Everything will be fine, Elizabeth reassured. We'll be okay. I know you will. It's just hard. I've never been away from them for so long. That's because now you're truly present. Before you were physically here but emotionally distant. Now you're connected, so the physical distance hurts more. Richard smiled sadly. You always know what to say. It's because I've been through a lot. Pain teaches wisdom, even when we don't want to learn. They stood there in silence for a moment, two adults carrying their own pains, united by their love for two special children. On the day of departure, the house was somber. The twins tried to be brave, but the moment Richard picked up his suitcase, they couldn't hold back their tears. They hugged their father tightly, as if they could keep him there through the strength of their embrace. You're the men of the house now, said Richard, kneeling to their level. Take care of Elizabeth for me, okay? And take care of each other like you always do. We're going to miss you, sobbed Michael. I'll miss you too, every day. But I'll be back before you know it, I promise. This time you have to keep your promise, Dad, said Matthew seriously. You have to. I will, you have my word. The car that would take Richard to the airport honked outside. It was time. He kissed the boys one more time, then looked at Elizabeth. Thank you, he said, and she understood that the gratitude went far beyond just taking care of the boys. He was bound by everything for having brought that family back to life. Go and come back soon, she replied simply. Richard left, and the boys ran to the window, watching the car disappear down the street. Elizabeth stood behind them, her hands on their small shoulders, offering silent comfort. And now? Asked Michael in a small voice. Now we live one day at a time, Elizabeth replied, and make each day count. The first days without Richard were the hardest. The boys were irritable, sad, regressing to some destructive behaviors they hadn't shown in months. Elizabeth remained calm, understanding it was the grieving process for their father's absence. She kept the promise of daily messages. Every night after dinner, they sat at the table and each boy wrote or drew something for their father. At first, the messages were angry, drawings of empty houses, words of frustration. Elizabeth didn't censure them. She let them express what they felt. The video calls with Richard were moments of joy mixed with sadness. The boys were happy to see him, but the end of the call always left a bigger void. It was a delicate balance, maintaining the connection without increasing the pain. But gradually things improved. The boys adapted to the routine, finding comfort in daily activities with Elizabeth. The garden continued to thrive, now with new beds. Elizabeth enrolled them in music lessons, discovering that Michael had a talent for piano and Matthew for drums. These were activities that filled their time and gave them new purpose. Margaret remained a constant presence, helping keep the household running, offering emotional support when needed. The family they had formed, though unconventional, was strong. 1 month passed, then 2. The messages to Richard had changed in tone. Now they were excited accounts of achievements, colourful drawings of happy moments, expressions of longing mixed with pride in how they were managing. Richard, from Washington, D.C., felt the distance like a physical pain, but he also saw his children's growth through the cameras, the messages, and Elizabeth's reports. They were more mature, more secure, and knowing that Elizabeth was there, caring for them with a mother's love, he could focus on work without the paralyzing guilt he used to feel. The project in Washington, D.C. was going well, even better than expected. With luck, Richard would be able to return a week earlier than planned. It was a surprise he was keeping, waiting for the right moment to tell the boys. But sometimes life has other surprises in store. It was an ordinary Thursday when everything changed. Elizabeth had taken the boys to school in the morning and returned home to help Margaret with some chores. She was in the garden watering the plants when Margaret called her from the house, her voice strange, worried. "Elizabeth, there's someone here to see you." Elizabeth entered through the kitchen, puzzled. She wasn't expecting visitors. In the living room, she found a woman she hadn't seen in over 3 years. Tall, slim, impeccably styled blonde hair, expensive clothes. Jennifer Harrison, the twins' mother, The woman who had abandoned the family and never looked back. "Jennifer," said Elizabeth, trying to hide her surprise. "I didn't know you were back in the United States. I returned a week ago." Jennifer's voice was cold, controlled. "We need to talk about my children." Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't good. Not good at all. End of story. Now tell me, what did you think of the story? From where are you listening to us? If you have something to share, leave it in the comments with sincere words. Do you think Elizabeth managed to make a difference in these boys' lives? We'd love to read your opinion. Thank you very much for your company.